On March 19th, 2026, while the world watched the polished choreography of international diplomacy at 10 Downing Street in London, a different, more sobering reality was being etched into the annals of history. Behind the expensive suits and the carefully rehearsed handshakes, a report from the Global Terrorism Index arrived like a thunderclap, stripping away the thin veneer of political success. It confirmed a staggering 46% increase in terrorism deaths across Nigeria during the year 2025. Nigeria, once a beacon of regional hope, had become one of the most volatile nations on earth. Yet, in a move that observers find logically puzzling, the narrative coming from the highest offices of power sought to point the finger elsewhere. President Tinubu reportedly chose to blame the sovereign nations of Mali, Niger, and the resilient land of Burkina Faso for this internal instability. This shift in rhetoric feels dangerously familiar, echoing the same patterns used before the 2011 intervention in Libya, a catastrophic move that scattered weapons like toxic seeds across our continent. Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a hinge in history. If this story resonates, show your support with a like, a comment, or a subscription. It means more than numbers, it keeps the story alive. Does it seem fair to cast blame upon the Sahel Alliance when the hard data paints a completely different picture? While Nigeria suffered, Burkina Faso, under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, recorded a massive 45% drop in terrorism fatalities. The contrast is not just a matter of numbers, it is a matter of vision. Traoré once remarked that a nation that feeds itself and protects its own people is a nation that cannot be enslaved. He understood that the path to true sovereignty is paved with the courage to say no to those who profit from our chaos. These words represent the hope of millions across the continent who see the Sahel as a beacon of resistance against manufactured dependency. This appears to be a calculated confrontation, framing the Sahel as a threat to justify deeper Western military involvement in the region. We must ask, is this a genuine security concern, or is it a carefully crafted script for regime change? To understand why the finger is being pointed at the Sahel Alliance, we must look at what was actually happening in London. Diplomacy often hides a darker truth behind expensive fabrics and polished speeches. The documents signed at 10 Downing Street tell a story of a nation being mortgaged piece by piece. The first major agreement was a deportation deal, a significant shift in how sovereignty is handled. Under this new arrangement, Nigeria will now recognize what the British government calls alternative identification documents. In plain language, this means the United Kingdom no longer needs to wait for formal passports or travel documents from a Nigerian embassy before putting people on a plane. This move is particularly shocking when you compare it to how other African nations have handled similar pressure. One might remember the controversial Rwanda scheme, where the previous British government tried to send asylum seekers to Kigali for processing. Even then, the Rwandan government resisted certain terms, and the United Kingdom Supreme Court eventually ruled the plan unlawful. That plan cost the British taxpayers £140 million and resulted in 0 deportations because of the legal and political pushback. Yet, the Nigerian leadership went to London and essentially signed up for a version of the same deal with very little resistance. The Nigerian Interior Minister described this as being a responsible country, but we must ask ourselves, who is this responsibility for? Is it for the citizens living abroad, or is it a responsibility to please a former colonial master? When we look at the strategic map of West Africa, we see a dangerous divide forming. On one side, you have the Alliance of Sahel States working to build a mutual defense and economic independence. On the other side, you have a leadership that is increasingly being used as a gateway for Western influence. This is the infrastructure of intervention being built piece by piece. The deportation deals are merely a thread in a larger web designed to isolate the revolutionary movements in the Sahel and maintain the old order. The irony is profound. A leader stands in London and blames his neighbors for terrorism when his own policies are creating a vacuum of opportunity that fuels local recruitment for insurgent groups. The weapons may come from the aftermath of the Libya intervention, but the anger and the desperation that drive young men to pick up those weapons are grown right at home through deals like these. Ibrahim Traoré has often pointed out that the greatest threat to Africa is not the enemy from outside, but the lack of vision from within. He has shown that even with limited resources, a nation can begin to secure itself if it focuses on the needs of its people rather than the demands of foreign capitals. The contrast between the path of the Sahel and the path being taken in London could not be sharper. One is seeking to break the chains of dependency, while the other seems to be polishing them. The price of this responsibility is not being paid in the boardrooms of London. It is being paid by millions of ordinary citizens whose lives are the collateral for these signatures. As we peel back the layers of this diplomatic facade, we find a lesson in modern neocolonialism that every African needs to hear. Because behind the smiles for the cameras lies a strategy of tide aid and infrastructure projects that ensure African economies remain dependent on Western finance. But the question remains, what happens when the next generation realizes that their ports are mortgaged and their brothers are being hunted in foreign lands with the permission of their own government? The accusations against Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso must be viewed against this background. It is a distraction from a much more uncomfortable truth about the state of sovereignty. But the lies about the terrorism data are about to be dismantled, and the truth about who is truly succeeding where others are failing will leave no room for deception. To understand the true price of the signatures inscribed at 10 Downing Street, we must look past the heavy oak doors and into the lives of those who never had a seat at the table. Diplomacy is often celebrated in billions, but its consequences are felt in pennies. The second major deal signed during this visit involves a £746 million package to refurbish two of Nigeria's largest seaports. At first glance, this sounds like a massive investment in African infrastructure, a gesture of goodwill between a former colonial power and a modern state. But we must look closer at the fine print, because this is where the lesson in modern neocolonialism begins. Let us take a moment here, not to rush forward, but to give thanks. Write a comment with a simple thank you to Traore, to Burkina Faso, or to the spirit of sovereignty itself. Gratitude is not a formality, it is recognition, it is dignity expressed in words. When you add your voice of thanks, you are not just engaging with a video, you are standing in solidarity with a story of freedom and pride. So, before we continue, take this pause to comment your thank you. Together, those words become a beacon that shines far beyond the screen. The reality of this £746 million package is as cold as the British steel it pays for. This money is not a grant, and it is not a gift. It is a loan, guaranteed by United Kingdom Export Finance and arranged through an international bank. According to official British press releases, at least £236 million of the supplier contracts will go directly to British companies. A British steel company has already secured its largest export order in years, thanks to this deal. This is a classic example of tide aid, a system where a wealthy nation lends money to a developing nation on the condition that the money is spent back in the wealthy nation. Nigeria takes on the long-term debt, while British firms capture the immediate profits. These ports, which handle over 70% of Nigeria's trade, are now being tied to a financing arrangement that ensures foreign control over the supply chain for years to come. While Ibrahim Traoré is busy talking about food sovereignty and building local industries in Burkina Faso, the leadership in Abuja is signing deals that keep the country trapped in a cycle of foreign debt and foreign contractors. This is how modern empires operate. They no longer need to send a governor in a white hat to sit in an office. Instead, they use debt and infrastructure projects to ensure that African economies remain dependent on Western technology and Western finance. When you hear the word investment, you must ask, who owns the equipment and who holds the debt? If the equipment is British and the debt is Nigerian, then it is not an investment in Nigeria. It is an investment in the British economy, paid for by the Nigerian people. But the debt is only half of the tragedy. There is a human cost to these polished speeches that can never be measured in pounds or naira. Consider the reality for the people with the calloused hands, those whose labor is the true foundation of the nation. In the heart of Lagos, a 52-year-old woman named Mama Ngozi sits in her small stall selling dried fish. Her eldest son, Chi, worked 3 jobs in London, sending back a few pounds every month to pay for her blood pressure medication and his younger sister's school fees. He was not a criminal, he was a lifeline. But because of the deportation deal signed in London, Chi was caught in the net of shifting immigration policies. he was deported within 48 hours without even a chance to pack his few belongings. Now he sits in a crowded room in Lagos, jobless and broken, while Mama Ngozi wonders how she will afford her next month of medicine. This is the reality of the responsibility the politicians talk about. For a woman like Mama Ngozi, the actions in London are not about high-level diplomacy. They are about a mother losing her son, while her president smiles for the cameras in a foreign capital. The leadership describes this as being a responsible country, but we must ask, responsible to whom? Is it to the mother in the fish market, or to the former colonial master who benefits from these deportations and steel contracts? While the diaspora and intellectuals across the world are calling for a united African front, we see a dangerous divergence. There is a deep irony in a leader standing in London and blaming his neighbours for terrorism when his own policies are creating a vacuum of opportunity that fuels local recruitment for insurgent groups. The anger and the desperation that drive young men to pick up weapons are grown right at home through deals like these. Ibrahim Traoré has often pointed out that the greatest threat to Africa is not the enemy from outside, but the lack of vision from within. The contrast between the path of the Sahel Alliance and the path being taken in London could not be sharper. One is seeking to break the chains of dependency, while the other seems to be polishing them. The infrastructure of intervention is being built piece by piece, not just with soldiers, but with signatures. By allowing the security situation to deteriorate while blaming the Sahel for the instability, a narrative is created that Nigeria needs Western help more than ever. This perceived need for help becomes the ultimate justification for signing away the rights of citizens and the control of vital infrastructure. But what happens when the next generation of Nigerians realizes that their ports are mortgaged and their brothers are being hunted in foreign lands with the permission of their own government? The price of this failure to stand for Africa will be paid in the villages of the Sahel and the streets of Lagos. The cost will be the blood of soldiers and the sovereignty of children. How can a country with a worsening record point the finger at a neighbor that is achieving the best record in the world? And what is the secret history of the NATO intervention that the West is so desperate for us to forget? To understand the gravity of the situation, we must look beyond the handshakes in London and peer into the secret maps being drawn in Brussels and Washington District of Columbia. The trip taken by the Nigerian president was not an isolated event, but a carefully timed piece of a much larger imperial blueprint. If we look at the calendar, we see a series of events that suggest a coordinated effort to encircle the sovereign nations of the Sahel and dismantle the revolutionary progress led by Ibrahim Traoré and his brothers in arms. On March 12, 2026, just 1 week before the arrival at 10 Downing Street, the European Parliament passed a resolution that should have sent shockwaves through every African capital. This resolution, which passed with an overwhelming majority of 524 votes, demanded the immediate release of the former president of Niger and called for what they termed the restoration of constitutional order. While the words constitutional order sound noble to the untrained ear, the history of Western intervention in Africa tells us that these are often code words for regime change. But the most revealing detail is not the resolution itself, but the man who proposed it. The resolution was championed by a French member of the European Parliament named Christophe Gomart. To understand why this matters, we must look at the resume of this retired general. Christophe Gomart is the same man who commanded the French Special Forces during the 2011 NATO intervention in Libya, which we have already identified as the primary source of the modern terrorism crisis in West Africa. He is also the man who led the initiation of French military operations in Mali in 2013. Before we reveal the next chapter, which is perhaps the most powerful assertion of sovereignty you will ever hear, I want to pause and speak directly to you. If this channel has moved you, if these stories are touching something deep in your spirit, then consider becoming a member, not for exclusive content or perks, but because supporting this channel is directly supporting narratives that mainstream media refuses to tell. Every membership is a vote for Sankara's Echo's mission. Every member becomes a co-creator of the revolution we are documenting. Join us. Stand with the principle that African wealth belongs to Africa. The very architect of the military interventions that destabilized the Sahel is now sitting in a comfortable chair in Europe, pushing for a new round of intervention. This general reportedly described the former Nigerian president as Europe's main partner in the Sahel, and warned that failing to secure his release would be a serious failure for Western interests. This is the logic of a predator who has lost its grip on its prey. The revolutionary governments in the Sahel have had the courage to tell France and the United States to leave their territory, and they have reclaimed their gold, their uranium, and their dignity. To the imperial mind, this is an unforgivable sin. The resolution passed in Brussels was the diplomatic signal, and the visit of the Nigerian president to London was the tactical follow-up. By blaming the Sahel Alliance for the rising terror in Nigeria, the leadership is essentially providing the moral justification for the European Union and the United Kingdom to act against Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. For the educated African diaspora living in the West, this pattern is all too familiar. From the overthrow of Thomas Sankara to the assassination of Muammar Gaddafi, the script remains the same. First, you demonize the revolutionary leader. Then, you create a narrative of regional instability. And finally, you use a neighboring country as a gateway for intervention. To suggest that the revolutionary governments in the Sahel are the cause of Nigeria's terror is to participate in a dangerous historical amnesia. We must look back to the year 2011, a history the West does not want us to discuss in the open. In 2011, a NATO-led coalition conducted over 26,000 military operations in Libya. They dismantled a sovereign African state and left a vacuum of power without any post-conflict plan. As a direct result of that Western intervention, heavy weapons, machine guns, anti-aircraft systems, and rockets flooded south from the Libyan armies into the Sahel. International monitoring groups have documented that the violence in Mali and the surrounding region was a direct consequence of that NATO intervention. Yet, while others seek help from London, Ibrahim Traoré is demonstrating what can be achieved when a leader focuses on mobilizing his own people. In Burkina Faso, the massive 45% drop in terrorism is not the result of a British port deal or a United States military base. It is the result of a fundamental shift in military doctrine and a focus on social justice. Traoré understood that you cannot fight an insurgency with only guns if the people feel abandoned by the state. He mobilized the volunteers for the defense of the homeland and integrated them with the regular army, creating a shield of the people. He focused on ensuring that farmers can return to their land and that the wealth of the nation stays within the nation. This success is a threat to the old order because it proves that Africa does not need a former colonial power to manage its security. If Burkina Faso can reduce terrorism so significantly without a United Kingdom military partnership, then what is the excuse for those who have the largest military budgets in the region? The only logical answer is that the problem is not coming from the Sahel, it is coming from a lack of strategic independence. The danger of this deception is that it sets the stage for a fratricidal conflict. By framing the Sahel Alliance as a source of terror, the groundwork is being laid for a coming war that would benefit no one except those who want to see Africa divided and weak. We are being prepared for a scenario where African soldiers are sent to fight African soldiers to protect Western interests. But the people of the Sahel have chosen a new path of sovereignty and dignity, and they are willing to endure sanctions and isolation to maintain their right to self-determination. The shadow of the American drones and the secret military machines designed to strike at the heart of the Sahel are no longer a distant rumor. They are a visible, tactical reality. We must look at the strategic map and see the infrastructure of intervention being built piece by piece. Since the airstrikes of late 2025 and the troop deployments in early 2026, the United States military has been steadily increasing its presence in northeastern Nigeria, specifically in the capital of Borno State. While the official narrative speaks of security partnerships, the timing is deeply cynical. For months, certain American senators were filling social media with emotional language regarding a supposed Christian genocide to build a case for intervention. Yet, as soon as the military assets were safely on the ground in the northeast, that campaign went quiet. The narrative served its purpose to get the boots on the ground, and now that the objective is achieved, the ordinary people who were used as the emotional backdrop are still living in fear while the geopolitical players move their pieces on the board. This is a classic example of how Western military intervention often creates more problems than it solves. A leading security analyst recently observed that this military partnership has actually emboldened insurgent groups because it reinforces their narrative of a religious war against foreign invaders. It is a dangerous deception that sets the stage for a fratricidal conflict. By framing the Sahel Alliance as a source of terror, the groundwork is being laid to use one African nation as a base to strike another. We are being prepared for a scenario where African soldiers are sent to fight African soldiers to protect Western interests that have nothing to do with the safety of the mother in the fish market or the farmer in the field. Take a second, right here, to tell us where you are watching from. Type the name of your city, your land, the soil beneath your feet. And as you do, know this, Sankara's echo sends you not just thanks, but a blessing for strength in your hands, for pride in your heart, for light on the road ahead. The comments below become a map of connection, showing that this message reaches far beyond borders. While some seek help from former colonial masters, the leaders of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have formed a mutual defense confederation that represents a genuine shift in power. They have not only expelled foreign troops, but have also invoked the principle of reciprocity in their diplomacy. When the United States imposed travel bans on their citizens, all three countries responded with identical restrictions on American travelers. This is the behavior of sovereign nations that no longer see themselves as children to be lectured by Washington or Paris. This defiance is what the Western powers find so dangerous. They fear that if the Sahel Alliance succeeds, it will inspire other African nations to demand the same level of independence. They fear a continent that no longer needs a manager for its own resources. True peace is not the absence of conflict while a foreign power controls your wealth. True peace is the ability of a nation to protect its own borders and feed its own people. If others were to follow the example of mobilizing their own citizens rather than mortgaging their ports, perhaps we would see a similar 45% drop in terrorism across the entire region. Instead, the choice has been made by some to polish the chains of dependency and provide a rhetorical cover for a European agenda. As Ibrahim Traoré has warned many times, the enemy within is often more dangerous than the enemy without, because the enemy within wears the clothes of a brother but carries the heart of a stranger. We must remain vigilant and continue to connect the dots between the deals signed in London, the resolutions in Brussels, and the troops in the northeast. What you have witnessed today is not a conclusion, but an opening. Africa's story of pride and independence is still being written, and each voice that joins makes the chorus stronger. Subscribe now not as a favor, but as a commitment to follow this journey. Because the next video will not just continue the story, it may reshape how you see the world. Do not let this moment pass into silence. Subscribe and stand ready for the chapter that comes after this one. The era of being a backyard for foreign powers is reaching its final hour. Ibrahim Traoré has shown us that when we reclaim our dignity, the chains of dependency begin to break. The path of Burkina Faso proves that even with limited resources, a nation can secure its own future if it focuses on the needs of its people. As we move forward, let the world see that the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré is not an isolated flame, but a rising sun that will eventually light up every corner of our sovereign continent.